Good afternoon, all of you.
Good afternoon.
Okay, good afternoon. Where were we in the last class? What were we doing? Hmm. Okay. Okay. So we were talking about reasoning. Deep, how many students are left with the presentation? Oh, okay. Are some of them ready today? Okay. 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 So we were talking about reasoning and reasoning is a process of making clear how your evidence supports your claim. So you're basically linking up when you're making a rational link between the evidence and the claim in an argument. Uh, That's what is called reasoning. So when we use what is known or familiar to reach conclusions about the unknown or unfamiliar, that's called reasoning. So claim is what you know. Evidence is how you know that. And reasoning is why does your evidence support your claim? And all of them gets you down to your explanation. I guess we have done all this. Hmm. Okay. Reasoning as inference making. Uh, Now, inference states the step one is made in linking the evidence to the claim. And inference can be both explicit or implicit in an argument. Now, when we make an explicit inference, when we explicitly state something, that becomes a reason. But when we don't explicitly state anything, we mean something and we assume that our recipients would understand the inference, the underlying meaning, that becomes inference. For example, in this example, when we say don't play in the street, you might get hurt. We are not explicitly stating what will cause the hurt or how will he get hurt, but we expect the recipient to assume that a car might hit you and you'll get hurt, you'll get injured. When we say that explicitly, don't play in the street because a car might hit you, we are explicitly stating that it's a busy road, and if you play, then a car might hit you. So, explicit is when we are making the reason, when we are stating the reason, the obvious reason. Uh, and implicit is when the reason is hidden within and we don't open up, we don't openly state that. That is called implicit. Now, there are six categories of reasoning that we will talk here. The first one is quasi logical, analogy, generalization, causal, coexistential, and dissociation. Okay, now the six categories of reasoning that we'll talk about in this chapter are the ones that I mentioned here. Now, these are the uh, most frequently used arguments by the arguers. And out of these six, the first five, cosmological, analogy, generalization, causal, and coexistential reasoning, are associative schemes. Now, they bring together elements and evaluate or organize them in terms of one another. Now, when we say associative, we basically mean that they bring all these elements together. They bring the elements together in terms of equivalence, or they might compare and contrast, or they might put these elements in sequence. So, what these arguments are doing, the first five types of arguments or reasoning are doing, is they are trying to uh, connect the different elements in an argument. They are trying to connect these elements of the argument uh, in terms of one another or with respect to the other. They might set up a comparison with the other elements of one element with the other element of the argument, or they might find them equivalent, equal, or same, or they would either put that also in a contrasting mode. But basically, they are putting each element or each part of the argument in terms of one another, and they are creating a whole. WHOLE. They are creating a whole from these parts. So they are these all the five types of arguments are looking at the entirety, looking at the wholeness of. So their approach is basically a whole part approach where they are looking at the whole and trying to dissect the individual parts. And when they are doing so, when they're dissecting the individual parts, the parts are usually seen in relation to the other parts. They're usually seen in relation to the other parts of the argument. Give me a minute. Okay. Sorry. Now, so all these five approaches are they look at the different parts of the argument and try to see a connection. They build up a connection, rather. We can say that the parts are somehow connected. So that could be in the form of equivalence, comparison, contrast, or sequencing. So all the parts of individual arguments are viewed in terms of one another. So they try to build up a connection with respect to the other parts. But the last category, which is dissociation, acts completely the opposite of what we have been doing in the uh, first five categories. The last the last type of reasoning disengages or disunites elements which apparently looks as united. So it deconstructs something which looks very connected, very united, looks as an organic form, uh, must might have lot of areas which doesn't connect to each other. So the last category is uh, dissociates or disengages the parts which apparently looks connected and united. That is a bit different from the other categories. Now we'll look at the first category, the first type, and that is called quasi-logical argument. Now, quasi-logical argument, as the name suggests, is quasi is similar. There's a similarity, so it is logically similar. The parts are similar. They are in a relation to one another, so as to make the connections between them similar to the connection in formal logic. If you remember syllogism, there is a syllogistic structure: major premises, minor premises, and conclusion. So quasi-logical arguments run with a syllogistic structure. So they are so simple and clearly defined that it can be reduced into formulas. So the statement is probable and not certain, like statements in formal logic. The arguments are rhetorical and co-orientational and based on the recipient's willingness to accept that the conclusion of the probable statement will come true. Okay. So the statement is probable. How is it different? How is quasi-logical different from syllogism, from formal logic? Is that the statements, the terms used in the statements are probable and they may not be certain. So, what the arguer wants is the arguer believes that the recipient should be willing to accept that the conclusion of the probable statement will come true. Okay. Now, there are three types of quasi logical argument or quasi logical reasoning. The first one is categorical syllogism, which is called transitivity. It is like the categorical syllogism, where very extremely simple, where you use three terms. So they must contain three and only three terms. Their premises must be true, and all three of the statements must be stated as simple classifications. So you're classifying. There's a class You are referring to a class or a category. That is why it is a categorical syllogism. And this can be reduced to a formula. So transitivity, this is called transitivity, and the uh, the relationship can be established among the terms by the arguer, and the relationship which is established is very simple and clear. So when you are there are you use three terms. So there are three terms, and when you relate the terms, uh, or when you connect the terms, they are extremely simple and clear. And these terms, these three terms, are probable and not certain. For example, you have the major premises that all students at Ivy League universities pay high tuitions. The minor premises says Mary is a student of Ivy League, and the conclusion is so Mary pays high tuition. So it is the exact replica of the categorical syllogistic structure that we have read before. And the relationship is that of equivalence. We are trying to define that the terms are equal to each other. So basically, all these arguments try to look at the parts in connection to or in relation to the other parts in the argument. So it's a part to whole approach. All the five categories of reasoning, the quasi logical, analogy, and all of them basically look uh, at the different parts, the individual parts of an argument, and make a relationship, try to forge a connection between the parts. It could be in the form of equivalence, which is there in transitivity. The parts are seen as equal, or incompatibility, where the parts are seen in contradiction with each other. They are in contradiction, they are incompatible with each other. So the two alternatives between now in incompatibility, which is another type of quasi-logical argument, we have the two terms, and the two alternatives uh, are in contradiction with each other, where a choice must be made. So the two alternatives are incompatible, and they show a conceptual conflict, a conflict of interest. You have to, there are two terms, and they are not in relation of equivalence. They are not equal to each other, neither are they related or dependent on each other. Rather, the two terms that we use in this kind of logical structure is they are contradictory to each other. They are incompatible with each other. For example, when I say, I hate all people who generalize. Now, when I'm saying I hate all people who generalize, that means also includes me, because I'm also generalizing all people. See, so this statement has an inherent contradiction. Okay, so Uh, Similarly, there is another statement which says if I want people to trust me, I have to deceive them into thinking I'm something I'm not. So these statements have an inherent contradiction in them. There are two elements, and both of them are in collision with each other. Here you have two terms, trust and deceive. They are not compatible with each other. They cannot stand together. So when we are making a statement like this is called incompatibility argument, where the two terms or the two situations or the events, or we can say the parts that make up the argument are in contradiction with each other, are are not compatible, because you have a possibility of a conceptual conflict with them or a conflict of interest. Now we need to resolve this conflict. And how do you think we are going to resolve the conflict with the contradicting uh, terms? And we can resolve them when we negate one contradiction, or when we make one irrelevant, so the other becomes relevant. In a state of contradiction, when there are two opposing and equally strong views, you have to negate or make one of them irrelevant. So the other becomes relevant. Now, if you want people to trust you, you don't have to deceive them into thinking who you are not. Okay, this has an inherent contradiction in itself. So you can negate one element or override one element and make the other relevant. So this makes the statement, or this resolves the incompatibility. Now the third type is reciprocity. Reciprocity asserts a hypothetical relationship between two situations or conditions and imply a mutual dependence between them. Unlike transitivity and incompatibility, reciprocity uh, implies a certain dependence, certain reciprocity between the two events or conditions. In incompatibility, you have contradiction. So the two situations are at loggerheads. They are not compatible, and there's a conceptual conflict. But in transitivity, you find or you try to establish a relationship of equivalence or equality between the two situations or conditions or two terms. But in reciprocity, you try to uh, assert a relationship which is dependent. So both the situations or events stated in the argument are related to each other in the sense that both of them are dependent. There is a mutual dependence between them. For example, uh, if you expect your superiors to treat you well, then you should treat your own subordinates well. So there's a relation between the two situations. If you are treating your superiors well, that means you have if you are expecting that your superiors treat you well, you have to treat your own subordinates well, right? So there is a mutual dependence here. You have to treat your own subordinate well so that your superior, when you are the subordinate, your superior treats you well. So there is a mutual dependence. What is honorable to learn is also honorable to teach. Hmm? Or do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. So if you expect something, or if you expect that others should treat you like this, you should also treat them the way the way you deserve to be treated. So the elements here are in reciprocity. They are reciprocal to each other. Okay, so quasi-logical argument. Uh, Now, quasi means equal. So we are trying to look at the different elements or parts of the argument in relation to the other through equivalence, incompatibility, or dependent on each other. So it is quasi logical arguments are logical and sort of resembles the formal logic, the syllogistic structure. Number one. Number two, they are so simple and clear that they can be reduced to formulas because it is limited to two or three terms only. Number three is quasi-logical arguments view two elements either in relation to each other, either through uh, equality, okay, like intransitivity, we see the two elements as equal or incompatible with each other, contradictory to each other, or dependent on each other, like reciprocity. But the relationship between the elements are simple and clear, and that is why they can be reduced to formulas. So, here we have the example of transitivity. Bill's friends are my friends, and you are a friend of Bill's. So you are a friend of mine. Okay, so those who are Bill's friend are also my friend, and because you are Bill's friend, uh, so you also become my friend. You're also my friend. Or in incompatibility. So in this example of transitivity, we are looking at the two elements as equal. We try to establish the trying to establish that the two elements are equal. In incompatibility, the candidate says he is opposed to nepotism, but he appointed his cousin as director of the White House Travel Office. The elements are in contradiction to each other. They are not compatible. They are not compatible because they are contradictory. Now, when you claim that you don't believe in nepotism and you go on to appoint your own cousin into the office, it belies the previous fact. So, how do you go on to resolve this conflict? Is by negating or making one element irrelevant. So, you can say that you're not opposed to nepotism. So, when you negate that you don't oppose nepotism, it is fine if you're going to appoint your cousin as the director, or you have to make the you have to nullify the appointment. If you're nullifying the appointment of your cousin, that establishes the fact that you're opposed to nepotism. But both of them can't stay together. They are incompatible. They are contradictory. They are in conflict. And the third one is reciprocity. So quasi-logical arguments can also be seen in reference to each other as dependent. So meeting our responsibilities means doing a better job. So when you say that if we do a better job, we will meet our responsibilities, and we are doing a better job, so we are meeting our responsibilities. So meeting our responsibilities is dependent on doing a better job. So both of them are related, and that is why it is reciprocity. That's quasi-logical argument. I think there isn't any questions, any doubts. It's clear, I guess. Now coming to analogy. Analogy is simply uh, making comparisons. You're comparing two items and establishing a relationship, trying to see the resemblance between the two objects, and establishing some kind of a relationship. So uh, when you say, uh, I give this example, uh, how do you, what is the, now when I say friend, pal, uh, companion, comrade, acquaintance, what does this mean? What is the analogy? How do you connect these words? Now, these terms are synonymous. They are related because they are synonymous with each other, they are synonymous to each other. Okay. So, analogy is something uh, that is that we learn a great deal from analogy, and most of our early learning occurs by means of analogy. For example, as a child, if we have been injured or hurt by the flame of a candle, we avoid other fires. It could be the fire on the gas stove, the fire on the bonfire, anything. But we tend to avoid this because our experience tells us that similar, or that anything which you consider as fire or flames can cause burn injuries. So, similar experiences have similar outcomes, and this is quite predictable. That's analogy. So, when we get to know that, let's see, uh, that fire burns, we avoid fire in the future also. So, analogy is uh, finding out the similarity between two objects, because two objects resemble each other in certain known respects. They will also resemble each other in respects that are unknown. Okay. So, when two objects resemble each other in certain known respects, they tend to resemble each other in respect that are not known, because similar situations will have similar outcomes and similar objects will exhibit the same characteristics. Now, there are two types of analogy: literal and figurative. Say, for example, when we are comparing two objects of the same class that share many characteristics. So we conclude that that a known characteristic that one possesses is shared by the other. So when object X, which is known, possesses these attributes A, B, C, and D, and we have another object Y, which belongs to the same class, and we are certain of it possessing the attributes of A, B, and C, then we certainly can conclude that object Y also possesses the attribute D, because object X and object Y are quite similar to each other, and object X has all the attributes, uh, or object Y has all the attributes of object X except one. So we go on to conclude that object Y must also have the attribute of D that object X has. So when we are comparing two objects of the same class that share that share almost all the characteristics and attributes, we can go on to conclude that a known characteristics that one possesses is shared by the other. Okay. Now that's literal analogy. Now coming to figurative analogy is uh, say figurative analogy is has something to do with figure of speech like metaphors. So figurative analogy is a comparison between two objects of different classes, and we are looking for a quality. So figurative analogy is different from literal analogy in the sense that the comparison that is made are metaphorical and illustrative rather than concrete and literal. So literal analogy compares two similar objects of the same class, whereas figurative analogy compares two different objects of different classes. Secondly, literal analogy is more concrete and literal, and figurative analogy is more metaphorical and illustrative, because we are comparing certain qualities that is present in, say, object Y and object X, which belong to different classes. In literal analogy, object X and object Y belong to the same class. In figurative, they don't belong to the same class, and that is why the need for metaphors, because we are comparing certain inherent qualities in both of them. For example, when we say Sardar Patel is a lion, that doesn't mean Sardar Patel is literally a lion. That means or is an iron man. We say no, Patel is an iron man. That means he's not made up of iron. Now, here we have this is a metaphorical analogy because we are comparing two different objects from different classes. We are comparing a human being with an animal, or we are comparing a human being or an animate object with an inanimate object, iron. So, what we are concerned are the qualities. So, like iron, he's strong, he stands tall. Or like a lion, he's extremely brave hearted, he's courageous and fearless. So, the qualities of one object which belongs to a different class altogether is compared to another, okay, with a different class. So, um, a human is compared to animals, and this is what we have been learning in Panchatantra. If you remember stories of Panchatantra and Jataka, especially in Panchatantra, you have animals personifying the qualities of humans. So we say she's as sly as a fox. Now that's another episode when we say she, when we when we have to compare a sly fox, we compare it with a woman. That's extremely, yeah, stereotypical. But then what we are doing is we are comparing a quality of the fox with that of a human. So there are two objects from different classes. Now, when we do that, we cannot really get into the literal meaning, the literal comparison. We can't establish a literal similarity. Fox and woman are not similar, literally. So we go into uh, comparing the qualities. So she's as sly as a fox, or he's as sly as a fox, to be gender neutral. So the quality of cleverness, slyness of a fox is compared to that of a human. That is metaphorical. So analogy arguments assume that two objects or situations or events are similar. One is known, the other is not known or is lesser known. So we go on to assume that if the two are similar in ways that are known, they will also be similar in other ways that are not known. So if object X and Y are similar in certain known characteristics like A, B, C, then we can also assume that object Y must also have the characteristics of D or the attribute of D. So we make an attribution to a comparatively unknown object, situation, or event. We are trying to make an attribution which is of an unknown object with that of the known object. And that's analogy. Now, coming to generalizations. Generalization is when we tend to generalize and try to apply it to the larger mass. When we observe or when we see that something which is true of certain members of a class might be true to the entire class. For example, if we find that some dogs bark, and dog is a very good analogy and allusion for your class, isn't it? Most of your class are dog lovers, so an allusion to dog. Now, if you find that a few dogs bark, you apply that characteristics to the entire class of dogs. So, generalizing is is making or applying what is true of certain members of a class to be true to other members of the same class or the whole. So, if few dogs in my locality are barking, I go on to apply that quality or the characteristics to the rest of the dogs. So, in general, and this also tends to develop a stereotypical attitude. So, stereotypes are born, you know, the are born out of these generalizations. So, when we tend to broadly generalize certain characteristics that we find in certain members of the class to the entire class, that is also known as stereotypes. So, generalization can um, also has the danger of being stereotypes, making things stereotypical. So it is the genesis of stereotype is our attitude of generalizing certain characteristics that we find in some and applying it to the rest of the class. So when we see that a few, or when we see that uh, some Bengali men are very henpecked husbands, we go on to apply that to the larger, to the entire class of Bengali men. That is stereotype. Okay. But we are not looking at stereotypes now. We are discussing about generalizing. So generalizations move from some to all members of a class. So when I go on to say that I have seen rabbits that have bushy tails. So I go on to generalize it as all rabbits must have bushy short tails. So it is moving from some to all members, or it is moving from a certain pattern that we have observed to predicting the pattern as the norm. So we can say that we have had a dry spells in during July and August. So we don't have the monsoon. See, there's no monsoon rain for the last 3 years. So there must be one every year. Since there is no rain, there's no monsoon in the month of July and August for the last 3 years. We talk about a pattern now. And then we go on to generalize that pattern. We say that this might be or this might be possible for every year. Every year maybe we are going to have a dry spell in the monsoon months because of the climate change. So that is generalizations. For example, now we have got an example. Now there is this mother who claims that or who explains why she monitors her child's television viewing by referring to a program she has seen. So the mother doesn't want her child, especially, to view television, to watch television on Saturday mornings. So she is regulating or she is monitoring her child's television viewing behavior by seeing only one program on television, and she's generalizing that. She says that I never let my daughter watch Saturday morning cartoons. I try to find something else to occupy her time. And why so? Because she believes that she goes on to watch a program on a Saturday morning, and she finds a lot of crash commercials and violence in the show, in the cartoon show, and she has literally categorized or literally uh, uh, literally calculated or has brought out a data or about the program. She says that uh, one third of the program had lot of commercials about candies and toys, unnecessary commercials, and she calculated that 32 there were 32 violent acts in the entire program of 2 hours. And then she goes on to generalize that, says that all the cartoon shows must be equally violent with inserted with crash commercials. So when we go on to apply a certain trend with with the entire class or with the entire group, that is called generalization. Like in this case, where the mother generalizes the entire cartoon television or cartoon programs by watching just one program on a Saturday morning. She watched this one program and she generalizes that all the cartoon programs must be violent, accompanied with some crash commercials. So that's generalization, and we will talk about the other three in the next class. And Deep, please ensure that your friends speak in the next class. Yeah. Thank you, all of you.